Chapter 96. It was near dawn, and Chicken George was standing in the doorway, swaying slightly and grinning at Matilda, who was sitting up waiting for him. His black derby was askew. "Fox got 'mongst de chickens," he slurred. "Me and Uncle Mingo been all night catchin' 'em." Matilda's upraised hand silenced him, and her tone was cold. "Reckon de fox give you liquor and sprinkled you wid dat rose water I smells." Chicken George's mouth opened. "Nah, George, you listen. Look here. Long as I's yo' wife, and mammy to our chillens, I be here when you leaves, and I be here when you gets back. 'Cause ain't us as much as yo'self you's doin' wrong. It right in the Bible, you sows what you reaps. Sow single, you reaps double. And Matthew 7th chapter say, Wid whatsoever measure you metes out to others, that shall be measured out to you again." He tried to pretend that he was too outraged to speak, but he just couldn't think of anything to say. Turning, he reeled back out the door and staggered down the road to sleep with the chickens. But he was back the next day, derby hat in hand, and dutifully spent all but a few nights with his family through the rest of that fall and winter, and those few only when he and the massa were away briefly on some trip. And when Matilda's next labor pains quickened early one morning in January of 1831, although it was the height of game-cocking season, he persuaded the massa to let him stay home, and to take the ailing Uncle Mingo along with him to that day's fights. Anxiously he paced outside the cabin door, wincing and frowning as he listened to Matilda's anguished moans and cries. Then, hearing other voices, he tiptoed gingerly close and heard his mammy Kizzy urging, "Keep pulling 'gainst my hand. Hard, honey. Another breath. Deep. That's right. Hold. Hold." Then Sister Sarah commanded, "Bear down. You hear me? Now push. Push." Then soon, "Here it come. Yes, Lord." When he heard sharp slaps, then an infant's shrill cries, Chicken George backed away several steps, dazed by what he had just heard. It wasn't long before Grandmammy Kizzy emerged, her face creasing into a grin. "Well, look like all y'all got in you is boys." He began leaping and springing about, whooping so boisterously that Miss Melizzy came bolting out the back door of the big house. He ran to meet her, scooped her up off her feet, whirled her around and round, and shouted, "Dis one be named after me." The next evening, for the third time, he gathered everyone around to listen as he told his family's newest member about the African great-granddaddy who called himself Kunta Kinte. At the end of a routine Caswell County landholders meeting late last August, the county courthouse was resounding with the parting calls of the local planters as they began to disperse and head homeward. Massa Leah was driving his wagon, Chicken George squatting in the back with his pocket clasp knife, gutting and scaling the string of hand-sized perch that the massa had just bought from a vendor. When the wagon stopped abruptly, George's eyes widened as he sat up in time to see Massa Leah already on the ground, hurrying along with many other masses toward a white man who had just dismounted from a heaving, lathered horse. He was shouting wildly to his swiftly enlarging crowd. Snatches of the words reached Chicken George and the other blacks, who listened gaping. "Don't know how many whole families dead, women, babies, sleepin' in their beds when the murderin' broke in. Axes, swords, clubs. Preacher named Nat Turner." The faces of the other blacks mirrored his own dread foreboding as the white men cursed and gestured with flushed, furious faces. His mind flashed back to those terror-filled months after that revolt in Charleston had been foiled with no one hurt. What on earth would happen now? Slit-eyed, the massa returned to the wagon, his face frozen with rage. Never looking back, he drove homeward at a mad gallop with Chicken George hanging on in the wagon bed with both hands. Reaching the big house, Massa Leah sprang from the wagon, leaving George staring at the cleaned fish. Moments later, Miss Melizzy ran out the kitchen door and rushed across the backyard toward Slave Row, flailing her hands over her bandanaed head. Then the massa reappeared, carrying his shotgun, his voice rasping at George. "Get to your cabin." Ordering everyone on Slave Row out of their quarters, Massa Leah told them icily what Chicken George had already heard. Knowing that he alone might possibly temper the Massa's wrath, George found his voice. "Please, Massa," he said, quavering, the shotgun jerked directly toward him. "Get everything out of your cabins. All you get." For the next hour, carrying, dragging, heaping their meager belongings outside, under the Massa's searching eyes and abusive threats of what he would do to whomever he found concealing any weapons or suspicious objects. They shook out every cloth, opened every container, cut and tore apart every corn-shuck mattress, and still his fury seemed beyond any bounds. With his boot he shattered Sister Sarah's box of nature remedies, sending her dried roots and herbs flying while he yelled at her, "Get rid of that damn voodoo." Before other cabins he flung away treasured possessions and smashed others with his fists or his feet. The 4 women were weeping. Uncle Pompey seemed paralyzed. The frightened children clutched tearfully about Matilda's skirts. Chicken George's own fury boiled as Matilda cried out, almost in pain, when the shotgun's butt smashed the front paneling of her precious grandfather clock. "Let me find a sharpened nail in there. Some will die." Leaving Slave Row in a shambles, the Massa rode in the wagon bed holding his shotgun as George drove them down the game fowl training area. Faced with the gun and the barked command for all of their belongings to be emptied out, the terrified old Uncle Mingo began blurting, "Ain't done nothin', Massa. Trust in—" "Got whole families dead now," yelled Massa Leah, confiscating the axe, the hatchet, the thin wedge, a metal frame, and both their pocket knives. The Massa loaded them all into the wagon as Chicken George and Uncle Mingo stood watching. "In case you try to break in, I'm sleeping with this shotgun," he shouted at them, lashing the horse into a gallop and disappearing up the road in a cloud of dust. Chapter 97. "Here you've got 4 boys in a row now." The Massa was getting off his horse in a game fowl training area. It had taken a full year for the White South's mingled fear and fury, including Massa Leah's, to fully subside. Though he had resumed taking Chicken George with him to cockfights a month or 2 after the revolt, the Massa's obvious coldness had taken the rest of a year to thaw. But for reasons unknown to either man, their relationship had seemed to grow closer than ever before ever since then. Neither one ever mentioned it, but they both hoped fervently that there would be no more black uprisings. "Yassa, big ol' fat boy born fo' daybreak, Massa," said Chicken George, who was mixing a dozen game hen egg whites and a pint of beer with oatmeal, cracked wheat, and a variety of crushed herbs to bake a fresh supply of the gamecock's special bread. He had learned the secret recipe only that morning, grudgingly, from ailing old Uncle Mingo, whom Massa Leah had ordered to rest in his cabin until his unpredictable and increasingly severe coughing spells eased off. In the meanwhile, Chicken George alone was intensely training 20-odd top prime gamecocks after almost ruthless cullings from among the 76 freshly matured birds recently brought in off the range walks. It was but 9 weeks from the day that he and Massa Leah were to leave for New Orleans. His years of local victories, plus no few in statewide competitions, had finally emboldened the Massa to pit his topmost dozen birds in that city's renowned New Year's Day season-opening main. If the Leah birds could win as many as half of their pittings against the caliber of championship fighting cocks assembled there, the Massa would not only win a fortune, but also find himself elevated overnight into recognition among the entire South's major gamecockers. Just the possibility was so exciting that Chicken George had been able to think of almost nothing else. Massa Leah had walked his horse over and tied a small rope from its halter onto the split-rail fence. Ambling back over near George, the Massa scuffed the toe of his boot against a clump of grass and said, "Mighty funny, 4 boy young'uns and you ain't never named none after me." Chicken George was surprised, delighted, and embarrassed. "You sho right, Massa," he exclaimed lamely. "That's 'zactly what to name dat boy. Tom. Yassa, Tom." The Massa looked gratified. Then he glanced toward the small cabin beneath a tree, his expression serious. "How's the old man?" "Tell you the truth, Massa, middle of last night he had a bad coughin' spell." That was fo dey sent Uncle Pompey down here to get me up there when 'Tilda havin' de baby. But when I cooked him sompin to eat, dis mawnin', he set up and ate it all, and swear he feel fine. He got mad when I tole him he got to stay in de bed till you say he can come out. Well, let the old buzzard stay in there another day, anyhow, said the massa. Maybe I ought to get a doctor to come down here and look him over. That bad coughing off and on, for long as it's been, it's no good. Nossa, but he sure don't believe in no doctors, massa. I don't care what he believes, but we'll see how he does the rest of the week. For the next hour, Massa Leah inspected the cockerels and the stags in their fence-row pens, and finally the magnificent birds that Chicken George was conditioning and training. Massa Leah was pleased with what he saw. Then, for a while, he talked about the forthcoming trip. It would take almost 6 weeks to reach New Orleans, he said, in the heavy new wagon he was having custom built in Greensboro. It would have an extended bed with 12 fitted removable cock coops, a special padded workbench for daily exercising of birds during travel, along with special shelves, racks, and bins that Massa Leah had specified to hold all necessary items and supplies for any long trips carrying gamecocks. It would be ready in 10 days. When Massa Leah left, Chicken George immersed himself in the day's remaining tasks. He was driving the gamecocks to the limit. The massa had given him the authority to use his own judgment in further culling out any birds in which he discovered the slightest flaw of any sort, as only the most comprehensively superb birds could stand a chance in the level of competition awaiting them in New Orleans. Working with the birds, he kept thinking about the music he had been told he was going to hear in New Orleans, including big brass bands marching in the streets. The black sailor he had met in Charleston had also said that every early Sunday afternoon, thousands of people would gather in a large public square called Place Congo to watch hundreds of slaves perform the dances of the African places and peoples they had come from, and the sailor had sworn that the New Orleans waterfront surpassed any other he had ever seen. And the women, an unending supply of them, said the sailor, as exotic as they were willing, of every kind and color, known as Creoles, Octoroons, and Quadroons. He could hardly wait to get there. Late that afternoon, after having meant to do so several times before when some chore had detained him, George finally knocked, then stepped on inside the cluttered, musty cabin of Uncle Mingo. "How you feelin'?" George asked. "Is it anything I can get you?" But he didn't need to wait for an answer. The old man was shockingly wan and weak, but as irritable as ever about his enforced inactivity. "Get out'n here. Go ax Massa how I feels. He know better'n I does." Since Uncle Mingo clearly wished to be left alone, Chicken George did leave, thinking that Mingo was getting to be like his leathery, pin-feathered old catchcocks, tough old veterans of many battles, but with age catching up and taking its toll, leaving mostly the instincts. By the time the last of the birds had been given their extra wing-strengthening exercise and returned to their coops, it was shortly after sundown, and Chicken George at last felt free to pay at least a brief visit home. Upon reaching his cabin, delighted to find Kizzy visiting with Matilda, he told them with much chuckling about the morning's exchange with the massa about naming the new baby Tom. When he was through, he noticed with great surprise that they seemed not to be sharing his enjoyment. It was Matilda who spoke first, her words flat and non-committal. "Well, I reckon lots of Toms in dis world." His mammy looked as if she had just had to chew a bar of soap. "I 'spect me and 'Tilda feelin' de same thing. And she rather spare yo' feelings 'bout yo' precious massa. Ain't nothin' wrong with de name Tom. Just sho wish it was some other Tom dis po' child get named after." She hesitated, then added quickly, "'Cause dat's just my 'pinion. Ain't my youngin' or my business." "Well, it's the Lawd's business," snapped Matilda, stepping across to get her Bible. "Fo' de child was born, I was huntin' in de scriptures to see what it say 'bout names." Hurriedly she thumbed pages, finding the section, page, and verse she sought, and read it aloud. "De memory of de just is blessed, but de name of de wicked shall rot." "Have mercy!" exclaimed Grandmammy Kizzy. Chicken George rose, incensed. "All right, den. Which one y'all gonna tell Massa we ain't?" He stood glaring at them. He was getting sick of so many goadings when he came in his own house, and he was fed up past the limit with Matilda's never-ending damnation from the Bible. He raked his mind for something he once heard, then it came. Y'all call him for Tom de Baptist, den." He shouted it so loudly that the faces of his 3 sons appeared in the bedroom doorway, and the day-old infant began crying as Chicken George stomped out. At that very moment, at the living-room writing desk in the big house, Massalia dipped his pen, then scrawled carefully inside his Bible's front cover a 5th date and birth line below the 4 names already recorded there. Chicken George and his first 3 sons, September 20th, 1833. Boy born to Matilda, named Tom Leah. Returning angrily down the road, George fumed that it wasn't that he didn't care for Matilda. She was the finest, most loyal woman he had ever met. A fine wife, however, was not necessarily one who piously chastised her husband every time he turned around just for being human. A man had a right, now and then, to enjoy the company of the kind of women who wanted only to enjoy laughter, liquor, wit, and the body's urgencies. And from their past years' travels together, he knew that Massalia felt the same. After fighting their gamecocks near any sizable town, they always stayed on an extra day, with the mules in a stable and some local gamecocker's helper paid well to care for the cooped birds, while he and Massalia went their separate ways. Meeting at the stable early the next morning, they would collect their gamecocks and ride on homeward, each nursing hangovers, and neither one saying a word about the fact that he knew the other one had been tomcattin'. It was 5 days before Chicken George's exasperation had diminished enough for him to think about returning home. Ready to forgive them, he strode up and rode to Slave Row and opened the cabin door. "Lawd, is that you, George?" said Matilda. "The chillens be so glad to see dey pappy again, 'specially this one. His eyes wasn't open yet when you was here last." Instantly furious, he was about to stalk right back outside when his glance fell upon his older 3 sons, aged 5, 3, and 2, huddled awkwardly together, staring at him almost fearfully. He felt an urge to grab them and hug them close. Soon he wouldn't be seeing them for 3 months when he went to New Orleans. He must bring them some really nice presents. Reluctantly, he sat down at the table when Matilda laid out a meal for him and sat down to bless the food. Then, standing back up, she said, "Virgil, go ask Grandmammy to come over here." Chicken George stopped chewing, merely swallowing what he had in his mouth. What did the 2 of them have planned to plague him with this time? Kizzy knocked and came in hugging Matilda, kissing, petting, and clucking over the 3 boys before glancing at her son. "How do? Ain't seen you so long." "How you do, Mammy?" Though he was fuming, he tried to make a weak joke of it. Settling in a chair and accepting the baby from Matilda, his mammy spoke almost conversationally. "George, yo chillen's been wantin' to ask you somethin'." She turned. "Ain't you, Virgil?" Chicken George saw the oldest boy hanging back. What had they primed him to say? "Pappy," he said finally in his piping voice, "you goin' to tell us about our great-granddaddy?" Matilda's eyes reached out to him. "You's a good man, George," said Kizzy softly. "Don't never let nobody tell you no different. And don't never get to feelin' we don't love you. I believes maybe you gets mixed up about who you is, and sometime who we is. We's yo blood, just like these chillen's great-grandpappy." "It's right in the scriptures," said Matilda. Seeing George's apprehensive glance, she added, "Everything in the Bible ain't somethin' hard. The scriptures have plenty 'bout love." Overwhelmed with emotion, Chicken George moved his chair near the hearth. The 3 boys squatted down before him. Their eyes glistened with anticipation, and Kizzy handed him the baby. Composing himself, he cleared his throat and began to tell his 4 sons their grandmammy's story of their great-grandpappy. "Pappy, I knows the story too," Virgil broke in, making a face at his younger brothers. He went ahead and told it himself, including even the African words. "He done heard it 3 times from you, and Grandmammy don't cross the dough-sill without tellin' it again," said Matilda with a laugh. George thought, how long had it been since he last heard his wife laughing? Trying to recapture the center of attention, Virgil jumped up and down. "Grandmammy say the African make us know who we is." "He do dat," said Grandmammy Kizzy, beaming. For the first time in a long time, Chicken George felt that his cabin was his home again. Chapter 98. 4 weeks late, the new wagon was ready to be picked up in Greensboro. How right the massa had been to have it built, Chicken George reflected as they drove there, for they must arrive in New Orleans not creaking and squeaking in this battered old heap, but in the finest wagon money could buy, looking the parts of a great gamecocker and his trainer. For the same reason, before they left Greensboro, he must borrow $1.50 from the massa to buy a new black derby, to go with the new green scarf that Matilda had almost finished knitting. He would also make sure that Matilda packed both his green and yellow suits, his wide-webbed best red suspenders, and plenty of shirts, drawers, socks, and handkerchiefs, for after the cockfighting he knew he'd have to look right when they were out on the town. Within moments after they arrived at the wagon-maker's shop, as he waited outside, George began hearing snatches of loud argument behind the closed door. He'd known the massa long enough to expect that sort of thing, so he didn't bother to listen. He was too busy sifting in his mind through the tasks he had to take care of at home before they left. The toughest one, he knew, would be the job of culling 7 more birds from the 19 magnificent specimens he had already trained to lethal keenness. There was room in the wagon for only 12, and selecting them would challenge not only his own judgment and the massa's, but also that of Uncle Mingo, who was once again up, out, and about, as vinegary and tart-tongued as ever. Inside the shop, Massalia's voice had risen to a shout. The inexcusable delay in finishing the wagon had cost him money, which should be deducted from the price. The wagon-maker was yelling back that he had rushed the job as fast as he could, and the price should really be higher because cost of materials had risen along with his free black workmen's outrageous salary demands. Listening now, Chicken George guessed that the massa was actually less angry than he seemed and was simply testing the wagon-maker to see if an argument might succeed in cutting at least a few dollars off the cost of the wagon. After a while, something must have worked out inside, for the altercation seemed to end, and soon Massalia and the wagon-maker came out, still red-faced, but acting and talking now in a friendly way. The tradesman shouted toward the area behind his shop, and a few more minutes later 4 blacks hove into view, bent nearly double, pulling the heavy new custom-built wagon behind them. George's eyes went wide at its sheer craftsmanship and beauty. He could feel the strength in its oaken frame and body. The center section of the luxuriously long bed showed the tops of the 12 removable cock coops. The iron axles and the hubs were obviously superbly balanced and greased, for despite the vehicle's imposing weight, he could hear no creaking or even rubbing sounds at all. Nor had he ever seen Massalia's face split into such a grin. "She's one of the best we've ever turned out," exclaimed the wagon master. "Nearly too pretty to drive," expansively Massalia said. "Well, she's about to roll a long way." The wagon-maker's head wagged. "New Orleans, that's a 6-week trip. Who's all going with you?" Massalia turned, gesturing at Chicken George on the old wagon driver's seat. "My there and 12 chickens." Anticipating the massa's command, Chicken George jumped down and went back to untie the pair of rented mules they'd brought along and led them over to the new wagon. One of the 4 blacks helped him hitch them up, then went back to join the others, who were paying Chicken George no more attention than he was to them. After all, they were free blacks, whom Massalia often said he couldn't stand the sight of. After walking around the wagon a few times with his eyes shining and a big smile on his face, the massa shook hands with the wagon-maker, thanked him, and climbed proudly up onto the seat of the new wagon. Wishing him good luck, the wagon-maker stood there shaking his head in admiration for his own work as Massalia led the way out of the lot with Chicken George following in the old wagon. On the long drive home, his new derby on the seat beside him, along with a pair of elegant gray felt spats that had set him back $1. George finished his mental checklist of chores that he had to take care of before they left for New Orleans, and started thinking about what had to be done to make sure things would keep running smoothly while they were gone. As difficult as he knew it would be to get along without him at home, he was confident that Matilda and Kizzy would be equal to the task, and though Uncle Mingo didn't get around quite as spryly anymore, and he was becoming increasingly forgetful with each passing year, George was sure the old man would be able to mind the chickens adequately until his return, but sooner or later he knew he was going to need more help than Mingo would be able to offer anymore. Somehow he must find a way around his wife's and his mammy's blindness to the rare opportunity he felt he could open for young Virgil, especially since at nearly 6 years of age the boy would soon have to start working in the fields. During his absence, it had occurred to him that Virgil could be assigned to help Uncle Mingo with the gamecocks, and then simply kept on in the job after they returned. But he had hardly brought up the idea before Matilda had flared, "Let massa buy somebody to help him den," and Kizzy had put in hotly, "Dem chickens done stole 'nuff from this family." Wanting no new fights with them, he hadn't tried to force the matter, but certainly didn't intend to see the massa possibly buy some total stranger to intrude in his and Uncle Mingo's private province. Even if the massa knew better than to bring in an outsider, though, George couldn't be sure if Virgil's help would be accepted by Uncle Mingo, who seemed to be rankling more and more ever since his first helper had developed with the masses a relationship closer than his own. Only recently, in his bitterness about not being allowed to come along with them to New Orleans, Mingo had snapped, "You and massa figure y'all can trust me to feed the chickens while you's gone?" George wished that Uncle Mingo would realize that he had nothing to do with the massa's decisions. At the same time, he wondered why the old man wouldn't simply face the fact that at 70-odd years of age, he just wasn't in any kind of shape to travel for 6 weeks in either direction. Almost surely he would fall sick somewhere, with all of the extra problems that would present to him in the massa. George wished hard that he knew some way to make Uncle Mingo feel better about the whole thing, or at least that Uncle Mingo would stop blaming him for everything. Finally, the 2 wagons turned off the big road and were rolling down the driveway. They were almost halfway to the big house when, to his amazement, he saw Mrs. Leah come onto the front porch and down the steps. A moment later, out the back door came Miss Melizzy. Then, hurrying from their cabins, he saw Matilda and their boys, Mammy Kizzy, Sister Sarah, and Uncle Pompey. What are they all doing here Thursday afternoon, wondered George, when they should be out in the fields? Were they so anxious to see the fine new wagon that they had risked the masses' anger? Then he saw their faces, and he knew that none of them cared anything about any new wagon. When Mrs. Leah kept walking on to meet the masses' wagon, George reined to a halt and leaned far over from his high driver's seat to hear better what she said to the massa. George saw the massa's body jerk upright as the missus fled back toward the house. Dumbfounded, George watched as Massa Leah clambered down from the new wagon and walked slowly, heavily back toward him. He saw the face, pale with shock, and suddenly he knew. The massa's words reached him as if from a distance. "Mingo's dead." Slumping sideways against the wagon seat, George was bawling as he never had before. He hardly felt the massa and Uncle Pompey half wrestling him onto the ground. Then Pompey on one side and Matilda on the other were guiding him towards Slave Row, with others around them weeping afresh at seeing his grief. Matilda helped him to lurch inside their cabin, followed by Kizzy with the baby. When he had recovered himself, they told him what had happened. "Y'all left Monday mornin'," said Matilda, "and that night nobody here slept no good. Seemed like Tuesday morning, we all got up feelin' like we'd heard whole lots of hoot owls and barkin' dogs. Then we heard the screamin'." "Was Melizzy!" exclaimed Kizzy. "Lawd, she hollered. Us all just flew out there where she done gone to slop the hogs, and there he was. Po' ol' soul, layin' out on the road. Looked like some pile of rags. He was still alive," said Matilda, "but it was just one side of his mouth movin'. I got right down close on my knees and could just barely make out what he was whisperin'. 'Believe I done had a stroke,' he say. 'Help me with the chickens. I ain't able.' Lord have mercy. None of us knowed what to do," said Kizzy, but Uncle Pompey tried to lift the limp, heavy form. When he failed, their combined efforts finally succeeded in lugging Uncle Mingo back to Slave Row and onto Pompey's bed. "George, he stunk so bad, with that sick smell on him," said Matilda. "We commenced fannin' his face, and he kept whisperin', 'The chickens got to get back.' Miss Melizzy done run and told Missus by den," said Kizzy, "and she come a wringin' her hands and cryin' and carryin' on. But not 'bout Brother Mingo. Nah, first thing she hollerin' was somebody better get to dem chickens lessen massa have a fit, so Matilda called Virgil. "I sho didn't want to," said Matilda. "You know how I feels about dat. One of us nuff down with them chickens. 'Sides, I done heard you talking 'bout stray dogs and foxes, even wildcats be round tryin' to eat them birds. But bless the child's heart, his eyes was bucked scairt, but he say, 'Mammy, I go, I just don't know what to do.' Uncle Pompey got a sack of corn and say, 'You throw handfuls dis to any chickens you sees, and I be down here soon's I can.' With no way to reach him and the massa, and Sister Sarah's telling them that she feared Uncle Mingo was beyond what her roots could cure, and not even the missus knowing how to contact any doctor, weren't nothing else could do 'cept just wait on y'all, they told him. Matilda began weeping, and George reached out to hold her hand. She cryin' 'cause when we got back in Pompey's cabin after talking to the missus, Mingo gone, said Kizzy. Lawd, knowed it just to look at him. She began sobbing herself. Po' old soul done died all by hisself. When Mrs. Leah was told, said Matilda, she commenced hollerin' she just don't know what to do with dead peoples, 'cept she done heerd Massa say dey starts to rotten if dey's kept out more'n a day. She say be way past dat 'fore y'all get back, so us gonna have to dig a hole. Lawd, exclaimed Kizzy, below de willow grove de ground kinda soft. We took the shovel, Pompey and us womens dug and dug, one at a time, till we had a hole enough to put him in. We come back, then Pompey bathed him up. He rubbed some glycerin on him Miss Melissy got from Missy, said Matilda, then sprinkled on some dat perfume you brung me last year. Weren't no decent clothes to put him in, continued Kizzy. The ones he had on stunk too bad, and what lil Pompey have was way too tight, so just rolled him up in 2 sheets. She said Uncle Pompey then had cut 2 straight green limbs while the women found old planks, and they had fashioned a litter. Have to say for Missus that when she seen us all bearin' him over de hole, said Matilda, she did come a-runnin' with the Bible. When we got him there, she read some scripture from de Psalm, and then I prayed, axin' de Lord to please rest and keep Mr. Mingo's soul. Then they had put the body in the grave and covered it. We done him de best we could. Don't care if you's mad, Matilda burst out, misreading the anguish on her husband's face. Grabbing her and squeezing her fiercely, he rasped, Nobody mad. Too stifled by his emotions to convey in words his anger with himself and the massa for not being there that morning. There might have been something they could have done to save him. A little later he left his cabin thinking about what concern, care, even love had been shown to Uncle Mingo by those who had always claimed to dislike him so. Seeing Uncle Pompey, he walked over and wrung his hands, and they talked a little while. Nearly as old as Uncle Mingo had been, Pompey said he had just come up from the game fowl area, leaving Virgil watching the chickens. Dat a good boy y'all got, he sho is. Then he said, when you goes down there, since it ain't been no rain, you can still see in the dust o' the road the crooked trail where Brother Mingo dragged hisself all the way up there in the night. George didn't want to see that. Leaving Uncle Pompey, he walked slowly to below the willow grove. A while passed before he could look directly at the freshly mounded earth. Moving about as if in a daze, picking up some rocks, he arranged them in a design around the grave. He felt unworthy. In order to avoid Mingo's dust trail in the road, he cut through a field of broken corn stalks to reach the game fowl area. You done a good job, boy. Now you better go on back up to your mammy, he said, patting Virgil roughly on the head, thrilling the boy with his first compliment. After he was gone, George sat down and stared at nothing, his mind tumbling with scenes from the past 15 years, listening to echoes of his teacher, his friend, his nearest to a father he ever had known. He could almost hear the cracked voice barking orders, speaking more gently of gamecocking, complaining bitterly about being cast aside. You and Massa figure y'all can trust me to feed the chickens whilst y'all's gone? George felt himself drowning in remorse. Questions came to him. Where was Uncle Mingo from before Massa Leah bought him? Who had been his family? He had never mentioned any. Had he a wife or children somewhere? George had been the closest person in the world to Uncle Mingo, yet he knew so little about the man who had taught him everything he knew. Chicken George paced. Dear God, where was the beloved old shambling companion with whom he had so many times trod every inch of this familiar place? He stayed there alone through the next day and night. It was Saturday morning before Massalia showed up, his face bleak and somber. He went directly to the point. I've been thinking through this whole thing. To start with, just burn Mingo's cabin now. That's the best way to get rid of it. A few minutes later they stood and watched as the flames consumed the small cabin that for over 40 years had been home to Uncle Mingo. Chicken George sensed that the massa had something else on his mind. He was unprepared for it when it came. I've been thinking about New Orleans, said the massa. There's too much at stake unless everything's right. He spoke slowly, almost as if he were talking to himself. Can't leave without somebody here to mind these chickens. Take too much time to find somebody. Maybe have to teach them to boot. No point in me going by myself. That much driving and 12 birds to look after. No point going to a chicken fight unless you aim to win. Just foolish to make the trip now. Chicken George swallowed. All those months of planning, all the masses spending, all of the masses' hopes to join the South's most elite game-cocking circles. Those birds so magnificently trained to beat anything with wings. Swallowing a second time, he said, Yassa. Chapter 99. Working by himself down there with a game fowl was so strange and lonely that Chicken George wondered how in the world Uncle Mingo had managed to do it for over 25 years before he came to join him. When Massa bought me, the old man had told him, and the flock got to growing, he kept saying he gonna buy me some help, but he never did, and I reckon I just find out chickens may be better company than people's is. Though George felt that he, too, loved the birds as much as any man could. With him, they could never take the place of people. But he needed someone to help him, he told himself, not to keep him company. As far as he was concerned, Virgil still seemed the most sensible choice. It would keep things all in the family, and he could train the boy just as Uncle Mingo had trained him. But since he wasn't anxious to deal with Matilda and Kizzy in order to get him, George tried to think of some game-fowl trainer acquaintance whom he might be able to persuade the massa to buy away from his present owner. But he knew that any real game-cocker massa would have to be in some truly desperate fix for money to even think about selling his trainer, especially to such a competitor as Massalia. So he began considering black hack fighters, but a good half of them were trainers like himself fighting their masses' cull-birds, and most of the others, like their birds, were third-raters or shady characters who fought very good birds that had been suspiciously acquired. There were a number of free black hack fighters he had seen who were really good, and were available for hire by the day, the week, the month, or even the year. But he knew there was no way Massalia would ever permit even the best free black trainer in North Carolina on his place. So George had no choice, and finally one evening he mustered his nerve to bring it up at home. "Fo you tells me again why you won't stand for it, woman. You listen to me. Next time Massa want me to travel with him somewhere, that's when he show gonna say, go get that oldest youngin' of yourn down here. And once that happen, Virgil be with chickens to stay, lessen Massa say different, which would be never, and you or me neither can't say a mumblin' word." He gestured to stop Matilda from interrupting. "Wait, ain't wantin' no back talk. I's trying to get you to see de boy need to come on down there now. If'n I bring him, then he can stay just long enough for me to teach him how to feed the birds when I has to leave, and help me exercise him durin' trainin' season. Den rest the time, most the year, he can be with y'all in the field." Seeing Matilda's tight expression, he shrugged elaborately and said with mock resignation, "All right, I just leave it up to you and Massa den." "What get me is you talk like Virgil grown already," said Matilda. "Don't you realize that child ain't but 6 years old? Just half the 12 you was when they drug you off down there." She paused. "But I knows he got to work now he's 6. So reckon can't do nothin' 'cept what you says. Much as I just gets mad every time I thinks about how them chickens stole you. Anybody listen to you and Mammy, y'all sound like chickens done snatched me up and off 'cross the ocean somewheres. Just wells to, most the time, much as you's gone. Gone? Who's settin' up here talking to you? Who been here every day this month? This month, maybe, but where you going to be for long? If you's talking about the fightin' season, I be wherever Massa tell me we's goin'. If you talking about right now, soon's I eats, I sho ain't gonna set here till some varmints creepin' round there and eat some chickens, or then I really be gone. Oh, you's finally 'greein' he'd sell you too? I believes he sell missus. She let his chickens get et. Look, she said, we done got by without no big fallin' out 'bout Virgil, so let's show don't start none 'bout nothin' else. I ain't arguin' in the first place, it's you the one. All right, George, I's through with it, Matilda said, setting steaming bowls on the table. Just eat your supper and get on back, and I send Virgil down there in the mornin'. Lessen you wants to take him back with you now. I can go get him from over at his grandmammy's. Nah, tomorrow be fine. But within a week it became clear to Chicken George that his eldest son lacked totally what had been his own boyhood fascination with game birds. 6 years old or not, it seemed inconceivable to George that after completing an assigned task, Virgil would either wander off and play alone, or just sit down somewhere and do nothing. Then Virgil would leap up as his father angrily exclaimed, "Get up from there! What you think this is? These ain't no pigs down there, these fightin' chickens." Then Virgil would do acceptably well whatever new task he was set to, but then once more, as George watched from the corner of his eye, he would see his son soon either sitting down again or going off to play. Fuming, he remembered how, as a boy, he had spent what little free time he had scampering around admiring the cockerels and the stags, plucking grass and catching grasshoppers to feed them, finding it all incredibly exciting. Though Uncle Mingo's way of training had been cool and businesslike, an order given, a watchful silence, then another order, George decided to try another approach with Virgil in hopes that he'd snap out of it. He'd talk to him. "What you been doin' with yo'self up yonder?" "Nothin', pappy." "Well, is you and the other young'uns gettin' along all right and mindin' yo' mammy and grandmammy?" "Yassa." "Reckon they feeds you pretty good, huh?" "Yassa." "What you like to eat the most?" "Anything mammy cooks us, yassa." The boy seemed to lack even the faintest imagination. He'd try a different tack. "Let me hear you tell this story about your great-granddaddy like you done once." Virgil obediently did so, rather woodenly. George's heart sank, but after standing there thoughtfully for a moment, the boy asked, "Pappy, is you seed my great-grandpappy?" "Nah, I ain't," he replied hopefully. "I knows 'bout him same as you does, from your grandmammy. She used to ride in the buggy wid him." "Sho she did. It was her pappy. Just like one dese days you tell yo' chillens you used to set down here 'mongst the chickens with yo' pappy." That seemed to confuse Virgil, who fell silent. After a few more such lame efforts, George reluctantly gave up, hoping that he'd have better luck with Ashford, George, and Tom. Without communicating to anyone his disappointment in Virgil, he regretfully decided to use the boy for the simple part-time duties he had discussed with Matilda, rather than try futilely to train him as a full-time permanent helper as he had actually intended. So when Chicken George felt Virgil had mastered the task of feeding and watering the cockerels and stags in their pens 3 times daily, he sent him back up to Matilda to begin working with them in the fields, which seemed to suit the boy just fine. Chicken George would never have breathed it to Matilda, Kizzy, or the others, but George had always felt a deep disdain for field work, which he saw as nothing more than a ceaseless drudge of wielding hoes under hot sun, dragging cotton sacks, picking endless tobacco worms, and beating corn stalks down for fodder, in relentless seasonal succession. With a chuckle he remembered Uncle Mingo saying, "Give me a good corn or cotton field or a good fightin' bird. I'll take the bird every time." It was exhilarating just to think of how anywhere a cockfight had been announced, if it was in a woods, an open cow pasture, or behind some massa's barn, the very air would become charged as gamecockers began converging on it, with their birds raucously crowing in their lust to win or die. In this summertime off-season, with the gamecocks molting off their old feathers, there was only routine work to be done, and Chicken George gradually became accustomed to not having anyone around to talk with, except for the chickens, in particular the pin-feathered veteran catchcock that had been practically Uncle Mingo's pet. You could have told us how sick he was, you old wall-eyed devil, he told the old bird one afternoon, at which it cocked its head for a second, as if aware that it was being addressed, and then went on pecking and scratching in its ever-hungry way. "You hears me talking to you," George said with amiable gruffness. You must have knowed he was real bad off. For a while he let his eyes idly follow the foraging bird. "Well, I reckon you knows he's gone now. I wonders if you's missin' the old man the way I is." But the old catchcock, pecking and scratching away, seemed not to be missing anyone, and finally Chicken George sent him squawking off with a tossed pebble. In another year or so, George reflected, the old bird will probably join Uncle Mingo wherever it is that old gamecockers and their birds go when they die. He wondered what had ever happened to the massa's very first bird, that 25-cent raffle ticket gamecock that had gotten him started more than 40 years ago. Did it finally catch a fatal gaff, or did it die an honored catchcock's death of old age? Why hadn't he ever asked Uncle Mingo about that? He must remember to ask the massa. Over 40 years back, the massa had told him he was only 17 when he had won the bird. That would make him around 56 or 57 now, around 30 years older than Chicken George. Thinking of the massa and of how he owned people, as well as chickens, all their lives, he found himself pondering what it must be like not to belong to someone. What would it be like to be free? It must not be all that good, or Massa Leah, like most whites, wouldn't hate free blacks so much. But then he remembered what a free black woman who had sold him some white lightning in Greensboro had told him once. "Everyone us free show y'all plantation. Livin' proof that just bein' a don't mean you have to be no slave. Yo massa don't never want you thinkin' nothin' 'bout dat." During his long solitudes in the Gamefell area, Chicken George began to think about that at length. He decided he was going to strike up conversation with some of the free blacks he always saw, but had always ignored when he and the massa went to the cities. Walking along the split-rail fence, feeding and watering the cockerels and stags, Chicken George enjoyed, as always, the stags' immature clucking angrily at him, as if they were rehearsing their coming savagery in the cockpits. He found himself thinking a lot about being owned. One afternoon, while he was on one of his periodic inspections of the birds that were maturing out on the range walk, he decided to amuse himself by trying out his nearly perfect imitation of a challenging cock's crow. Almost always in the past, it would bring instantly forth a furious defender crowing angrily in reply and jerking its head this way and that in search of the intruding rival he was sure he had just heard. Today was no exception. But the magnificent gamecock that burst from the underbrush in response to his call stood beating its wings explosively against its body for almost half a minute before its crow seemed to shatter the autumn afternoon. The bright sunlight glinted off its iridescent plumage. Its carriage was powerful and ferocious, from the glittering eyes to the stout yellow legs with their lethal spurs. Every ounce, every inch of him symbolized its boldness, spirit, and freedom so dramatically that Chicken George left vowing this bird must never be caught and trained and trimmed. It must remain there with its hens among the pines, untouched and free. Chapter 100. The new cockfighting season was fast approaching, but Massa Leah hadn't mentioned New Orleans. Chicken George hadn't really expected him to. Somehow he had known that trip was never going to happen. But he and the massa made a very big impression at the local mains when they showed up in their gleaming, custom-built 12-coupe wagon. And their luck was running good. Massa Leah averaged almost 4 wins out of 5, and George, using the best of the culls, did just about as well in the Caswell County hack fights. It was a busy season as well as a profitable one, but George happened to be home again when his 5th son was born late that year. Matilda said she wanted to name this one James. She said, "James somehow or another always been my favorite, 'mongst all the disciples." Chicken George agreed, with a private grimace. Wherever he and Massa Leah traveled for any distance now, it seemed that he would hear of increasing bitterness against white people. On their most recent trip, a free black had told George about Osceola, chief of the Seminole Indians in the state called Florida. When white men recaptured Osceola's black wife, an escaped slave, he had organized a war party of 2,000 Seminoles and escaped black slaves to track and ambush a detachment of the U.S. Army. Over 100 soldiers were killed, according to the story, and a much larger army force was hard after Osceola's men, who were running, hiding, and sniping from their trails and recesses in the Florida swamps. And the cockfight season of 1836 hadn't long ended when Chicken George heard that at some place called the Alamo, a band of Mexicans had massacred a garrison of white Texans, including a woodsman named Davy Crockett, who was famous as a friend and defender of the Indians. Later that year, he heard of greater white losses to the Mexicans under a General Santa Anna, who was said to boast of himself as the greatest cockfighter in the world. If that was true, George wondered why he'd never heard of him till now. It was during the spring of the next year, when George returned from a trip to tell Slave Row still another extraordinary piece of news. Dunn heard it from the courthouse janitor at the county seat. That new President Van Buren done ordered the army to drive all the Indians west the Mississippi River. Sound for show now like gonna be them Indians River Jordan, said Matilda. That's what Indians gettin' for lettin' in white folks in dis country in the first place, said Uncle Pompey. Whole heap of folks, 'cludin' me, till I got grown, ain't knowed at first weren't nobody in dis country but Indians, fishin' and huntin' and fightin' one another, just mindin' dey own business. Then here come little old boat o' white folks, a-wavin' and grinnin'. Hey, y'all red mens, how about let us come catch a bite and a nap amongst y'all, and let's be friends? Huh, I betcha nowadays them Indians wish they's made that boat look like a porcupine with they arrows. After the massa attended the next Caswell County landholders' meeting, Chicken George came back with still more news about the Indians. Here tell it's a General Winfield Scott done warned 'em that white folks bein' Christians ain't wanted to shed no mo' Indians' blood, so them with any sense best to hurry up and get to movin'. Here tell if a Indian even looked like he wanted to fight, the soldiers shot him in his tracks. And then the army commenced drivin' just thousands them Indians towards somewheres called Oklahoma. Say ain't no tellin' how many along the way was kilt or took sick and died. Just evil, evil, exclaimed Matilda. But there was some good news too, only this time it was waiting for him when he got home from one of his trips in 1837. His 6th son in a row was born. Matilda named him Louis, but after finding out where she got the name for James, Chicken George decided not even to inquire why. Less exuberant than she'd been at the birth of each previous grandchild, Kizzy said, "Look like to me y'all ain't gonna never have nothin' but boys." "Mammy Kizzy, bad as I's layin' up here hurtin' and you soundin' disappointed," cried Matilda from the bed. "Ain't neither. I loves my grandboys and y'all knows it. But just seem like y'all could have one gal." Chicken George laughed. "We get right to work on a gal for you, Mammy." "You get outen here," exclaimed Matilda. But only a few months passed before a look at Matilda made it clear that George intended to be a man of his word. "Huh, sho can tell when that man been spendin' regular time home," commented Sister Sarah. "Seem like he wasn't them roosters." Miss Melizzy agreed. When her pains of labor came once again, the waiting, pacing George heard, amid his wife's anguished moans and cries, his mother's yelps of, "Thank you, Jesus! Thank you, Jesus!" and he needed no further advisement that at last he had fathered a girl. Even before the baby was cleaned off, Matilda told her mother-in-law that she and George had agreed years before that their first girl would be named Kizzy. "Ain't done lived in vain," Grandmammy cried at intervals throughout the rest of the day. Nothing would do for her then, but that the following afternoon Chicken George would come up from the game-fowl area and tell once again about the African great-grandpappy Kunta Kinte for the 6 boys and the infant Kizzy in his lap. One night about 2 months later, with all of the children finally asleep, George asked, "Tilda, how much money is we got saved up?" She looked at him surprised. "A little over $100. "Dat all?" "Dat all. It's a wonder it's dat much. Ain't I been tellin' you all these years the way you spends ain't hardly no point even do no talkin' about no savin'?" All right, he said guiltily. But Matilda pursued the point, "Not countin' what you winned and spent what I ain't never seed, which was yo' business. You want to guess 'bout how much you done give me to save since we been married? Then you borrowin' back?" "All right, how much?" Matilda paused for effect. twixt $3,000. Woo, he whistled. I is? Watching his expression change, she sensed that she had never observed him grow more serious in all their 12 years together. Off down yonder by myself so much, he said finally. I've been thinking 'bout a whole heap of things. He paused. She thought he seemed almost embarrassed by whatever he was about to say. One thing I've been thinking, if an us could save enough these next comin' years, maybe us could buy ourselves free. Matilda was too astounded to speak. He gestured impatiently. I wish you get yo' a pencil to figure some, and quit bucking yo' eyes at me like you ain't got no sense. Still stunned, Matilda got her pencil and a piece of paper and sat back down at the table. Trouble to start wid, he said. Just can't do nothin' but guess round what mass it acts for us all, me and you and a passel of young'uns. Start wid you. Round the county seat, I knows men feel hands is bringin' 'bout $1,000 apiece. Women's is worth less, so let's call you 'bout 800. Getting up, bending to inspect Matilda's moving pencil, he sat back down. Den let's say Massa let us have our chillin's, all 8, 'bout 300 apiece. Ain't but 7, said Matilda. That new one you say started in your belly again make 8. Oh, she said, smiling. She figured at length. Dat make 2,400. Just for chillin's? His tone mingled doubt with outrage. Matilda refigured. 8 threes is 24, plus the 800 for me. That make exactly 30 That's same as 3,000. Woo! Don't carry on so yet. The big one, you. She looked at him. How much you figure for you? Serious as it was, he couldn't resist asking, what you think I's worth? If I'd a knowed, I'd a tried to buy you for Massa myself. They both laughed. George, I don't even know how come we's talkin' sich as this, nohow. You know good and well Massa ain't gonna never sell you. He didn't answer right away, but then he said, Tilda, I ain't never mentioned this. Reckon since I know you don't hardly even like to hear Massa's name called, but I betcha 25 different times, one or another, he done talk to me about whenever he get enough together to build the fine big house he want, with 6 columns cross the front. He say him and Missus could live off in what the crops make, and he spec he be gettin' out in the chicken fightin' business. He say he's steady gettin' too old to keep puttin' up with all the worries. I have to see that to believe it, George. Him or you neither ain't gonna never give up messin' with chickens. I'm tellin' you what he say, if you can listen. Look a here, Uncle Pompey say Massa about 63 years old right now. Give him another 5-6 years. It ain't easy for no real old man to keep runnin' here and yonder fightin' no birds. I didn't pay him much attention neither till I kept thinkin' that, yeah, he really might let us buy ourselves, and specially if we be payin' him enough would help him build that big house he want. Huh, Matilda grunted without conviction. All right, let's talk about it. What do you reckon he'd want for you? Well, his expression seemed to mingle pride in one way and pain in another, at what he was about to say. Well, buggy driver at that Massa Jewett done swore up and down to me one time that he overheard his massa tellin' somebody he'd offered Massa Leah $4,000 for me. Woo-wee, Matilda was flabbergasted. See, you ain't never knowed the valuable you sleeps wid. But quickly he was serious again. I don't really believe that. I spec he just made up that lie trying to see if I'd be fool enough to swallow it. Anyhow, I go by what's gettin' paid nowadays for with the best trades, like the carpenters and blacksmiths, sich as them. Dey's sellin' twixt 2,000-3,000. I knows that for a fact. He paused, peering at her waiting pencil. Put down 3,000. He paused again. How much that be? Matilda figured. She said then that the total estimated cost to buy their family would be $6,200. But what about Mammy Kizzy? I get to Mammy, he said impatiently. He thought, Mammy gettin' pretty old now. That'd help her cost less. This year she turnin' 50, said Matilda. Put down $600. He watched the pencil move. Now what dat? Matilda's face strained with concentration. Now it's $6,800. Woo, she'll make you start to see is money to white folks. George spoke very slowly. "But I believes I can hack fight and do it. 'Cause gon' mean waitin' and savin' up a long time." He noticed that Matilda seemed discomfited. "I knows right what's on your mind," he said. "Miss Melizzy, Sister Sarah, and Uncle Pompey." Matilda looked grateful that he knew. He said, "Dey's family to me even fo' dey was to you." "Lawd, George," she exclaimed, "just don't see how just one man's supposed to be trying to buy everybody, but I sure just couldn't walk off and leave dem." "We got plenty time, Tilda. Let's us just cross that bridge when we gets to it." "That's the truth. You right." She looked down at the figures that she had written. "George, I just can't hardly believe we's talking about what we is." She felt herself beginning to dare to believe it, that the two of them, together, were actually engaging for the first time in a monumental family discussion. She felt an intense urge to spring around the table and embrace him as tightly as she could, but she felt too much to move, or even speak for a few moments. Then she asked, "George, how come you got to thinking this?" He was quiet for a moment. "I got by myself, and seemed like I just got to thinking mo, like I told you." "Well," she said softly, "show is nice." "We ain't gettin' nowhere," he exclaimed. "All we ever doin' is gettin' massa somewhere." Matilda felt like shouting "Jubilee," but made herself keep still. "I been talking wid Free when me and massa go to cities," George went on. "Dey say de free up north is the best off. Say dem lives amongst one another in dey own houses, and gets good jobs. Well, I know I can get me a job. Plenty cockfightin' up north. Even famous cockfightin'. I's heerd live right in that New York City. A Uncle Billy Roger, a Uncle Pete what got a big flock and own a great big gamblin' joint, and another one call Jackson. Dey say don't nobody beat his birds, hardly." He further astounded Matilda. "And another thing, I wants to see our young'uns learnin' to read and write like you can." "Lawd, better'n me, I hope," Matilda exclaimed, her eyes shining. "And I wants 'em to learn trades." Abruptly he grinned, pausing for effect. "How you reckon you look settin' in your house, your own stuffed furniture, and all dem lil knick-knacks? How about Miss Tilda be axin' the other Free women's over for tea in de mornin's, and y'all just settin' round talkin' 'bout wrangin' y'all's flowers and sich as dat?" Matilda burst into nearly shrieking laughter. "Lawd, man, you was just crazy." When she stopped laughing, she felt more love for him than she'd ever felt before. "I reckon de Lawd is done give me what I needs dis night." Eyes welling, she put her hand on his. "You really think we can do it, George? What you think I's been settin' up here talking about, woman? You 'member de night we 'greed to marry, what I tol' you?" His face said that he didn't. "I tol' you somethin' out in de first chapter o' Ruth. Tol' you, 'Whither thou goes, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people.' You don't 'member me sayin' dat?" "Yeah, I reckon." "Well, I ain't never felt that way more'n I does right now." Chapter 101. Removing his derby with one hand, with the other Chicken George held out to Massa Leah a small water pitcher that looked as if it were woven tightly of thick strands of wire. "My boy, Tom, de one we done name for you, massa, he done made dis for his grandmammy, but I just want you to see it." Looking dubious, Massa Leah took the pitcher by its carved cow-horn handle and gave it a cursory inspection. "Uh-huh," he grunted non-committally. George realized that he'd have to try harder. "Yassa, made that out'n just old rusty scrap barbed wire, massa. Built him a real hot charcoal fire and kept bendin' and meltin' one wire against another till he got de shape, then give it a kind o' brazing all over. Dat Tom always been real handy, massa." He halted again, wanting some response, but none came. Seeing that he'd have to reveal his real intent without gaining the tactical advantage of some advance positive reaction to Tom's craftsmanship, George took the plunge. "Yassa, dis boy been so proud of carryin' yo' name all his life, massa. Us all really believes he just get de chance, he make you a good blacksmith." An instantly disapproving expression came upon Massa Leah's face, as if by reflex, and it fueled George's determination not to fail Matilda and Kizzy in his promise to help Tom. He saw that he'd have to make what he knew would be the strongest appeal to Massa Leah, picturing the financial advantages. "Massa, every year money you spendin' on blacksmithin' you could be savin'. Ain't none us never told you how Tom already been savin' you some, sharpenin' hoe blades and sickles and different other tools, as well as fixin' a lot of things gets broken round here. Reason I brings it up, when you sent me over for that Isaiah blacksmith to put de new wheel rims on de wagon, he was tellin' Massa Askew been years promisin' him a helper dat he need real bad, much work as he doin' to make money fo' his massa. He told me he sho be glad to make a blacksmith outen any good boy he could get holt of, so I thought right away 'bout Tom. If he was to learn, massa, ain't just he could do everything we needs round here, but he could be taken in work to make you plenty mo, just like that Isaiah doin' for Massa Askew." George felt sure he'd struck a nerve, but he couldn't be sure, for the massa carefully showed no sign. "Looks to me this boy of yours is spending more time making this kind of stuff instead of working," said Massa Leah, thrusting the metal pitcher back into George's hands. "Tom ain't missed a day since he started working in yo' fields, massa. He do sich as dis jes' on Sundays, when he off. Ever since he been any size, seem like he got fixin' and makin' things in his blood. Every Sunday he out in dat lil' old lean-to shed he done fixed hisself behind de barn, a-burnin' and bangin' on somethin' another. Fact, we's been scairt he 'sturb you and de missus." "Well, I'll think about it," Massa Leah said, turning abruptly and walking away, leaving Chicken George standing there confused and frustrated, purposely, he felt sure, holding the metal pitcher. Miss Melizzy was seated in the kitchen peeling turnips when the massa walked in. She half turned around, no longer springing to her feet as she would have done in years past, but she didn't think he'd mind, since she had reached that point in age and service where some small infractions could be permitted. Massa Leah went straight to the point. "What about this boy named Tom?" "Tom? You mean Tilda's Tom, massa? Well, how many Toms out there? You know the one I mean. What about him?" Miss Melizzy knew exactly what he was asking. Just a few minutes before, Grandmammy Kizzy had told her of Chicken George's uncertainty about how Massa Leah had reacted to his proposal. Well, now she knew, but her opinion of young Tom was so high, and not just because he'd made her new S-curved pothooks, that she decided to hesitate a few seconds before answering in order to sound impartial. "Well," she said finally, "a body wouldn't pick him out of a crowd to talk to, massa, 'cause the boy ain't never been much wid words, but I sho can tell you for a fact, he the smartest young'un out there, and he the goodest of dem big boys to boot." Miss Melizzy paused meaningfully. "And I spec he gonna grow up to be mo' man in whole lot of ways than his pappy is." "What are you talking about? What kind of ways?" "Just man ways, massa, mo' solid and 'pendable, and not fo' no foolishness no kind o' way, and like dat. He gonna be de kind of man make some woman a mighty good husband." "Well, I hope he hasn't got matin' on his mind," said Massa Leah, probing, "'cause I just permitted it with that oldest one. What's his name?" "Virgil, massa." "Right, and every weekend he's running off to bed down with her over at the curry plantation when he ought to be here workin'." "Naw, sah, not Tom. He too young for sich as dat on his mind, and I spec he won't be too quick about it even when he get grown. Least not till he find just the right gal he want." "You're too old to know about young bucks nowadays," said Massa Leah. "Wouldn't surprise me if one left my plow and meal in the field to go chasin' some gal. 'Greed wid you if talkin' 'bout dat Ashford, massa, 'cause he took to woman chasin' just like his pappy, but Tom just ain't that kind, that's all." "Well, all right. If I go on what you say, the boy sounds like he might be fit for something." "Go on what any us say 'bout him, massa." Miss Melizzy concealed her jubilation. "Don't know what you axin' 'bout Tom fo', but he sho to pick of dem big boys." Massa Leah broke the news to Chicken George 5 days later. "I've worked out an arrangement to board your Tom over at the Askew plantation," he announced solemnly, "for a 3-year apprenticeship with that blacksmith Isaiah." George was so elated that it was all he could do to keep from picking up the massa and spinning him around. Instead, he just grinned from ear to ear and began to sputter his appreciation. "You better be right about that boy, George. On the strength of your assurances, I recommended him very highly to Massa Askew. If he isn't as good as you say, I'll have him back here so fast it'll make your head spin. And if he gets out of line, if he betrays my trust in any way, I'll take it out of your hide as his. Do you understand? He won't let you down, massa. You got my promise on dat. Dat boy a chip off the old block. That's what I'm afraid of. Have him packed and ready to leave in the morning. Yassa, and thank you, sir. You won't never regret it. Racing up to Slave Row as soon as the massa was gone, Chicken George was so near to bursting with pride in his achievement when he told them the great news that he didn't see the wry smiles exchanged by Matilda and Kizzy, who had been the ones responsible for urging him to approach the massa in the first place. Soon he stood in the doorway hollering, "Tom! Tom! You, Tom!" "Yay, Pappy!" he replied, coming from behind the barn. "Boy, come here." A moment later Tom's mouth was open as wide as his eyes. The incredible news had come as a total surprise, for they hadn't wanted him to be disappointed if the effort hadn't worked. But as overjoyed as he was, their heaped congratulations so embarrassed him that Tom got back outside as quickly as he could, partly to give himself the chance to realize that his dream had actually come true. He hadn't noticed while he was in the cabin that his little sisters, Kizzy and Mary, had scampered outside and breathlessly spread the news among their brothers. The lanky Virgil was just trotting up from his chores in the barn before leaving for the plantation of his recent bride. He merely grunted something non-committal under his breath and hurried on past Tom, who smiled since Virgil had been in a daze ever since he had jumped the broom. But Tom tensed when he saw stocky, powerful 18-year-old Ashford approaching, trailed by their younger brothers James and Lewis. After nearly a lifetime of unaccountable hostility between him and Ashford, Tom wasn't surprised at his snarling bitterness. "You always been dey pet, butterin' up everybody so you gets the favors. Now you going off laughin' at us, still in the feel." He made a swift feint as if to strike Tom, drawing gasps from James and Lewis. "I'm going to get you yet, just watch," and Ashford stalked off, Tom staring levelly after him, certain that someday he and Ashford were going to have a showdown. What Tom heard from Lil George was another kind of bitterness. "Sure wish I was getting away from here. Fo Pappy worked me to death down there. Just 'cause I got his name, he figure I's supposed to be crazy as he is 'bout chickens. I hates them stinkin' things." As for the 10-year-old Kizzy and 8-year-old Mary, having spread the news, they now trailed Tom around the rest of the afternoon, their shy looks making it clear that he was their adored and favorite big brother. The next morning, after seeing Tom off in the mule cart with Virgil, Kizzy, Sister Sarah, and Matilda, had just begun the day's chopping in the field when Grandmammy Kizzy observed, "Anybody seen us all up there snifflin' and cryin' and goin' on would 'a thought we weren't gonna never see that child again." "Huh, no mo' chile, honey," exclaimed Sister Sarah. "Dat Tom de next man round dis place."